this isn't a specific map about Nanshin-ron, but more or less it shows the trajectory of where the invasions will be coming. But to explain, initially the Japanese had favored another strategy known as Hokushin-ron, which means northern strike policy, whereas Nanshin-ron is southern strike policy. Both both are going to be pretty important to the story. But anyways, Hokushin-ron would have been against the Soviet Union, and the Imperial Japanese Army favored this heavily. That was until they literally got wrecked at the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol, and that's in 1939. The Soviets under General Zhukov, who we've spoken about in some length, exposed their military weaknesses, and the subsequent Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of 1941 pretty much discouraged the idea of a northern campaign. Now,
That I'll just say, Khalkhin was probably one of the most decisive defeats the Japanese would face. Like
I
if you just
wouldn't,
take it as a
you know
no, I'm
what?
talking about if you take it as percentage of units that were
Hmm,
committed to the battle that were
yes.
lost. In that regards, it was.
If they continued to fight, the Japanese would have completely lost, and Manchuria could have been invaded. But the Japanese got their shit together and were like, okay, we need to sign something. This is bad. And on the other side, as bad as it was for the Japanese at Khalkhin, you can't overlook the massive amount of casualties the Russians also incurred. Sorry, the Soviets. It was not completely one-sided. Whereas in 1945, when you look at the invasion of Manchuria, that is completely one-sided. That is just an absolute trouncing upon the
Well, that time
Japanese.
they also have like better equipment as well
Oh yeah,
and battle hardened vet. I think if I'm not mistaken, a good chunk of those 1 million troops were actually like veterans in the war against
yep,
Nazi Germany that were redeployed.
yeah, especially armor. It it was like Mike Tyson fighting an infant, basically, as you would say. But
Prime Mike Tyson, just so I'm clear.
yeah, exactly. So obviously Nanshin-ron was going to be favored, and this was strongly backed by the Imperial Japanese Navy, as it would require them. And do remember, the Army and the Navy are fighting for resources. They're literally scratching each other's throats to just be the ones actually controlling what's going on. Now, Nanshin-ron would be aimed at expanding it's a southward advance, specifically through Southeast Asia and into places in the Pacific. And the reason why they want to do this advance in the first place is they want to secure vital resources such as oil, rubber, tin, anything that is necessary for sustaining Japan's war effort, which primarily, almost majority of which is against China. Because for everyone, just to brutally summarize this, the reason why Japan even goes to war with the West is they've basically been forced into a corner. They want to continue their war against China or they'll lose face. And the only way to continue the war is they basically need to get their hands on some war materials that they don't have. So, push comes to shove, they decide to solve the problem of being in a war by going into another war, which is more common than you would think when it comes to leadership of brutal dictatorships. But leading up to the Pacific War, the United States and their allies, specifically the UK and the Dutch, began imposing and escalating economic embargoes on Japan in response to their aggressive expansion into China and then in Southeast Asia. After Japan invaded China officially, they technically did in 1931, but officially in 1937, the US began imposing a moral, like a moral embargo, you would call it, on aircraft and military supplies, and this would take into effect 1938. Then in July of 1940, the United States basically starts restricting exports of aviation fuel and scrap metal. Britain and the Netherlands then start joining in by cutting back Japan's access to their rubber and tin. So this is specifically from like places like Malaya, for example. And then following Japan's occupation of French Indochina in July of 1941, the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands freeze Japanese assets and they effectively halt trade, specifically oil. All three of these nations have oil. So the British have oil in Burma, and the Dutch East Indies has the most oil that's basically right there and available to the Japanese. And then, of course, something like 80% of Japan's oil supply is coming from the States at this time. So after cutting off 80% of everything that Japan needs to continue its war, you can imagine Japan has been put into a corner, especially when it comes to oil. So it has a few options ahead of it, abandon the expansion it's doing, like the China War, or proceed with the Nanshin-ron strategy. And well, guess what? They went with the Nanshin-ron strategy. Now, as pertaining to this extremely elaborate strategy, Japan opted to invade territories in the east to seize their abundant resources, notably with many of the Japanese forces stuck in China. Literally, like 35 out of 51 divisions are not going to leave the China theater. They have basically 11 to work with, but they're going to start invading multiple places. By late November, preparations for the assaults are well underway, and on December the 2nd, the command, famously known as Climb Mount Nitaka, is issued initiating the offensives. So, from December 1941 to January 1942, Japan launches a series of rapid invasions across the Pacific and Southeast Asia to secure the critical resources and strategic positions. To just go through this a little bit for people who don't know, obviously on December the 7th and the 8th, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. It's a surprise attack to cripple and neutralize the US Pacific Fleet. Simultaneously, they invade Malaya, Thailand, Hong Kong, and then they push into Burma and the rest of Southeast Asia. Now, in the Pacific, they launch operations against the Philippines. That begins on December the 8th with a landing at Luzon and Mindanao. Despite courageous American and Filipino resistance under poor leadership, in my estimation, Manila would fall by January the 2nd, and this would push the defenders to Bataan and Corregidor. Now, within the Dutch East Indies, Japan would eventually invade Borneo by mid-December, and they would seize its key oil fields. By January, they start expanding into Sumatra and Java, and Burma is going to get invaded also. And this, of course, is just destroying everything in sight. It's people don't bring it up enough, but the first 6 months of the Pacific War is just incredible. The planning, meticulous, everything goes off almost without a hitch. It's very impressive. As
I
Dan,
think
yeah,
let's just also add, I think the Japanese, for all the operations, right, across the Dutch East Indies, Burma, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, Hong Kong, they only commit about 11 or 12 army divisions, with around 35 or so being stuck in China at this time.
yep,
So I think
it's
it's pretty impressive to be launching simultaneous military operations at scale, which are all amphibious in nature.
yeah. I've had this discussion actually with Cody from Alternate History Hub because a long, long, long time ago, he had done some episodes looking into, alternate histories of the Pacific War. And something that he really couldn't fathom was you, despite Japan's immense military and its ability, you can't take out more divisions from China and Manchuria. So the Kwangtung army has to protect the Manchurian border in case the Soviets decide to attack. And then you've got all these other divisions in China that are locked in a absolute attritional war. So you have about 10 to 11 divisions to work with to fight the West in the Pacific, Asia Pacific. It's actually incredible what they managed to do with what is a large force, of course, but in the grand scheme of things, not so much. But yeah, it limited their ability. Like, for example, people have written alternate history books where they invade Hawaii. Absolutely impossible. They couldn't possibly do this. It would be ridiculous. But yeah. Now, to our episode at hand, for the invasion of Malaya, the Japanese planned multiple naval landings in southern Thailand and northern Malaya, followed by a push through the Malayan Peninsula along the western coastal plain, culminating in a grand assault, or better called a siege, upon Singapore. And this would be across the Strait of Johor. The entire strategy was devised by a rather infamous and evil individual, in my estimation, Soichi Masanobu. Did you write anything about Soichi?
Just a little bit. Do you mind just
Yeah, I
letting me
will
share?
stop sharing.
So, Craig, I'll just call out that I know you know these guys way better than me, so feel free to chip in. But Suji Masanobu was, despite having a very prominent role within the Japanese planning and politics, I will add, I'm actually surprised he still remains, he only attained the rank of a colonel. So, Suji Masanobu, he did, like, his very early career, there's really nothing to even warrant any information. The most important things start coming out in 1934, where within the Japanese military, there are the two schools of thoughts, right? Or parties, factions, whatever we want to call it. So you have the control faction of the Toshihiya, I think that's how you pronounced it, which is where the future Prime Minister Hideki Tojo is a member of. And then you also have the Kodoha faction or the Imperial Way faction. This is interestingly where another protagonist, well, protagonist is I think the proper term, the guy who will be commanding the invasion is from.